Hello, thank you very much for your time and welcoming us on Harry Hall's table for our discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming over.
Yeah, on a conversation about global education, its meaning, and with our also Henriette and Hannah from SAIH and AUF. It's also two organizations that have very good force of changing the education, like as a power tool in Norway and also globally. And before we actually start our, let's say, conversation and dive into the topic, I would like to ask not even a question, but probably to share every one of you the story or the moment when education have changed or impacted somebody's life. So I'd like to share a story or a moment when somebody you know or have met, when education, somebody impacted or changed their lives or somehow had a change, so you can share.
I can start. For me, it was actually my father. He came from a very typical Norwegian working class background, and this is more about higher education. But the fact that his future became very different, because in Norway we have free higher education also. So that definitely changed his life. So I would say that if we talk about the so-called American dream, that you can be anything, if we can keep that idea, make that idea become something that would be natural for any country. My father is an example of that. And just a few days, we had our national day here in Norway, and Afghanistan refugee, Aziz, he was there, and he is, of course, for me, a very touching and great example of what can be done. He came here with no education. He's been here for 10 years. He held a long speech in perfect Norwegian about how he had been given the chance to become an engineer here in Norway, which I hope he will be able to do, or people like us will be able to do in Afghanistan, also from humble background in the future.
It's very interesting and impactful, and I'm very glad to hear that we have such stories. But I also want to say, not only in a good way, but probably also lack of education could change as well from your story somehow.
Maybe I can follow up, because I'm also working for an organization working with higher education. So I'm not going to speak on behalf of a specific student or an experience, but from our work in SAIH. So when you asked this, I thought immediately about the Students at Risk program that we and NSO, which is the National Student Organization in Norway, started 10 years ago, and that program has contributed to protection of over 150 student activists now. So the Students at Risk program is a protection mechanism where student activists who cannot finish their education back home due to their human rights activism and the political work can come to Norway through this program and finish their education here. And in a world that is burning, as we know, and authoritarian regimes on the rise, such programs are in need and more necessary than ever. And what we see both now but also throughout history is that education, students, academics are the first to be targeted almost always when authoritarian powers are tightening their grip, because they know that these arenas foster critical thinking. Students challenge power and want to change the world. So for me, that example is a very tangible example of how education and activism meet, on how a continuation of education and access to further education can both provide the safety and security and a breathing space, but also further opportunities for human rights work. So I think that will be one example of how education can lead to change and impact from our end. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think how education and activism meets would probably be the headline of my answer as well, because I think education was the primary reason why I got involved with politics. I moved to the UK, to London, in 2018, right after I finished high school, to start my university degree. And I was quite shocked because the UK isn't really far from Norway, politically or geographically, but the way they approach equality in education is quite shockingly different. And the way I realized that was because when I looked at my classmates, they all came from very similar backgrounds. They all came from some sort of wealth. There were daughters and sons of doctors and lawyers and bankers. And I was there because of the Norwegian Educational Loan Fund. My mother is a primary school teacher that provided for me and my brother a loan. So I was there because of state funding. And that made me realize that the way we approach education in Norway is quite significant, and it's really worth protecting and promoting. So when you think back to your high school classmates or your primary school classmates, they're likely to come from very different backgrounds. There will be sons of like cleaners or daughters of bankers, but it's also likely it doesn't really matter that much. And that is quite unique with the Norwegian school system. And that is also why I think it's natural that Norway is one of the countries that really promotes those exact values abroad, globally, and give the gift of what education is really supposed to be, a fair chance and an equal chance. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things about Norway, but I think it's also so right that we take that space when we approach our humanitarian aid and our investments abroad.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. And it also makes me realize how could be different or diverse our backgrounds and stories, but it's still something that's going on day to day. We have the stories, and it's not just isolated stories or randomly. It's people, real people who are living through that. And that's why actually we are here. And I also want to say that unfortunately right now we're having a trend of declining funding for education. And also in Norway we believe that Norway have actually power and influence to other countries on education, as well as they are historically also funded a lot of things regarding education. So here is also the consequences that could be after that. So I want to bring the question regarding that on our table to discuss and to see your perspective and your views, because also right now public investments in education in Norway also declining. So what could be done, or what we need to shift in this, I think, negative trend, and maybe steps that we need to take, or maybe engage somebody also to have, or who we must to invite to see our conversation, I don't know, to bring this more and more. And I'm excited to hear from all of you what you think.
Yeah, well, we just spent the first 10 minutes here, praising the Norwegian education system. So we can, of course, broadcast that as much as we can. So it's one of the foundations of Norway prospering so much. So in many ways, Norway is an example of being one of the poorest countries in Europe in the 1920s. And not only Norway, but the whole of Scandinavia. Definitely, economic historians, they will tell you that education is the foundation of the Nordic countries becoming so prosperous. So it should be an example for other countries. If you compare, for example, to Portugal, which had Oliveira Salazar, who was the dictator there, and who would himself coming from a very humble background, but getting some education, he would actually use his position to suppress education in Portugal, keeping Portugal being one of the poorest countries throughout up until the 1970s and after that too. Probably because the population didn't get education, because it was, like you said, that students would be, very liable to attack the government there. That was his, tactics. So I think there are examples from history, how on a national level you can prosper, that investment in education is good for the whole country, not only for the individuals.
For sure. And I think you're posing it's a quite big question. And the political backdrop for this conversation is obviously very dramatic, as Henriette touched upon. There was a new article published in The Lancet that estimated that among 22 million people are in immediate risk of dying within 2030 due to American and European aid cuts alone. It's very dramatic. We haven't seen something similar in our time. And I think that provokes the question of, where do we start? If 22 million people are at risk of dying, how do we target our aid money in the best way possible? So I think it is important that Norway tries to show some sort of leadership. We have done it before, but unfortunately, we're not seeing it to the extent that is needed right now, where some countries really take leaderships in order to reverse what we're seeing right now, to prevent those 22 million from dying, first and foremost, but also to really focus on long-term development aid so that we won't need development aid, which should be the final goal.
Exactly. If I can follow up a bit on that as well, because NORAD launched a report last year, in October last year, showcasing that education is actually one of the most important and effective tools when it comes to poverty reduction, when it comes to advancing equality, to social mobility. So understanding that education is so fundamental for securing other rights, for securing other public goods and services. And to your question, like what needs to change in this negative trend, because it is a negative trend in Norway as well. Since 2021, 70% of aid that was supposed to be allocated to education has been cut, and in the revised budget that came last week, another 80 million was cut to education. And to me, that does not show a country that understands what is at stake and how important education is for democratic resilience, for securing human rights, for securing a just society. So I think also what we need to do is to be clearer and sharper in our arguments to why education is so important, and also that it is a stepping stone to other rights, and showcasing how key it is for Norway's other priorities, because Norway says that we are prioritizing democratic societies. We want everyone to have secured rights. So making that link clearer, I think, will be important in the debates we're having around aid in the coming time.
But I also want to a bit follow up on what you just shared, probably to you, Hannah. As I know as well, Norway wants their development strategy be focused on stability and security. And in this case, shouldn't be education be a part of that strategy as well, rather than just separate?
I mean, definitely, but I think that the debate that is currently playing out is connected to what our development minister has launched as Project Turning Point, which is a good initiative at heart because it tackles a critique that has been very long-standing, saying that Norwegian aid is spread out too thinly. We prioritize every good cause, and therefore we don't really prioritize, has been the critique. And Project Turning Point, as it has been presented, has been sort of a way to tackle that issue and to have a more clear vision of what Norwegian humanitarian aid is really focused on and what it's trying to do. However, I think it's safe to say that the government hasn't reached that turning point just yet, because with the revised national budget that we saw last week, we see that Norway is actually one of the countries that receive a lot of Norwegian humanitarian aid still, because we use Norwegian aid money to fund immigration costs in Norway. And I think that is a witness of us not really prioritizing where we can make the most impact, where we can make the biggest change. And I really hope that throughout this project, with Project Turning Point, we can really be clear about that linkage that Henriette talked about, that education, aid is one of the most effective ways to go about poverty reduction, etc. And to make that linkage so clear that that is a fundamental building block in the way we approach humanitarian aid in the years to follow.
Thank you very much for your sharings and for your thoughts, and it's a lot to think about and to analyze, to move forward. I also would like you, Henriette and Jo Nesbø, if you can share, because you have a bit another tools in your disposal, like advocacy, storytelling, as well as communication with community, how you can use it in the direction of education, supporting globally education.
Well, I think that what I can do is, of course, to promote reading, hopefully. But I think that what fiction can do better than non-fiction is to ask the right questions, ask the what-if questions, and let's pretend that this or that happened, and to have your readers imagine different scenarios. What would happen if, for example, the enemies of education would take over the world? What would the world look like? But also use examples from history, from seeing actual examples of how you can see education having made lives better for individuals, but also for societies.
Thank you.
Maybe going a bit back to my other points, but I think also opening it up that working for the right to education and securing the right to education, access to education, is also more than development policy, that it has to be just understood as fundamental and as a foundation for achieving equitable and rights-based societies. And I think that's where Norway, but also other actors working with aid and development cooperation, has to think and kind of change that mindset. And historically, Norway has been a very good advocate for the right to education. So I do think we both have the credibility and I would say also the opportunity and responsibility to change this trend, as you talked about with Project Vendepunkt, that turning point should be going away from the trend from 2021, that we are prioritizing education because it's such a fundamental part for safeguarding other rights and equitable societies.
Can I just also add that with humanitarian aid, it's key to really have the broad publics with you, because we talk about the 1% of gross national income in Norway that we should prioritize quite a significant amount of money to bettering the lives of people globally. And it's not enough to just have a group of politicians that is convinced that that is the right thing to do. Project Turning Point is good in the sense that we know that Norwegian people are positive when it comes to Norwegian aid spending, but they're critical to whether or not we use that money in an efficient way. So those things has to be seen in a parallel way, that we also, being the country that is really, really using that much money on humanitarian aid, we must also be the country that uses that money in the most efficient way. And I think that is key to making people believe in the project that we're promoting. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all of your sharings and opinion on that. And also based on what you shared, of course we have people who can understand and agree on what we think as well, but there are still people who are debate on topics that we are having or don't really agree on that. So maybe what we can, how we can convince them to, or which argument we can have to them to tell that this is important, this is on what we work and what have been done, actually, as you said, also historically, some examples. So which arguments we can use to talk with them or even examples?
I mean, there is a clear link between education and standard of living in the lives of people and the welfare, democracy, all the things that we want for a society is positively linked to education. So I think that just keep on pushing those points. And for, like I said when we started, that Norway, that we're so happy with our own educational system. I was traveling in the United States and a few years ago, and the most frequently asked question was, after I talked about my Harry Hole character, they said, okay, something else, you're from Norway. Is it a myth, or is it really true that you can go to college for free in Norway? And that is, of course, a system that we just talked about. That for a society to be fair, we have to start at the same place when we start running. And having free education is definitely something that we need to have that. Or else what we're creating are class societies from the get-go. So I think that to have us supporting other countries to have a system that is at least closer to our system is something that we should strive for and not just be happy with how we have it here. I also think that if you look at, like you said, that there's a unstable world right now, war is threatening. I think that Bill Clinton, he had a good point when he said that aid, helping other countries rising to our economic level is the most important investment we can make for stable peace in this world.
I think I agree a lot on education should be available for everyone and also contextually relevant for anyone. And a lot of what we've talked about, that it's fundamental for peaceful and just societies. That should be convincing.
Yeah, and I think the point that Jo touches upon, that is on equality and getting the same start here in Norway, is quite linked to how people perceive aid policy. I mean, it's natural if you're poor and you're struggling to provide food on the table for your kids, that development aid is not what's on the top of your head, or the most natural thing to vote on a party based upon your thoughts on aid policy. And I think that's very natural. And I think the reason why people have been so positive to spending money on aid in Norway is also because we have had the good educational system that we started to talk about, and that people have had the mental capacity to think about people out there and how Norway can make a change, positive change globally. And I think we can't lose that thought when we talk about what arguments can persuade people in one direction or the other when we talk about humanitarian aid. I think it's important because it's taxpayers' money at the end of the day, a lot of what the government is spending on humanitarian aid. And I think we owe it to them to show that we are using that money efficiently, but also that we target it in the direction that can make the most positive impact. But I think it's a good standard of living is also fundamental for people to actually promote and support the humanitarian aid spending that we're promoting here. And also to draw the link that what we do out there and building welfare out there is also promoting welfare at home. And if we want to build a safe society for our children here, humanitarian aid is the obvious way to go about it. But that linkage is not always evident. And I think it's important to draw it in every possible way.
I think it's interesting to, and something that we need to discuss is how do we prioritize the aid? immediate relief or the more long-term education investment, because there's almost like a moral dilemma there. How long-term can you be without coming across as a cynic? I was in Niger, one of the poorest countries in Africa, some years ago, and we were working on a relief from the hunger there. That was actually when I started thinking that in order to help this country, we have to think long term, because there are so many problems with the short-term solutions. But in order to do that, you have to sort of, it's morally, can you really say we are taking money away from starving children and giving it to children that are going to survive and provide for this country in the long term? And that's a hard thing to do, not only for individuals, but for politicians and societies also. But it's something I think we need to discuss.
For sure.
Definitely. And I definitely think it's a balance, but on the point of long term and also priorities, I think to really achieve lasting change, it needs to be locally led development. Like if it's going to be efficient, if it's going to be impactful, it has to be the local actors on the ground who sit with expertise in their context, but also in their topics and thematics areas that they work with, that are leading the projects along. And I think for Project Vendepunkt or other debates on aid, Norway has to have a focus on flexible funding, that we're adapting to a ever-changing context around the world right now, that power imbalances are challenged, that we talk about shifting power, that it is actually the local actors leading the way in the projects on the ground to achieve long-lasting change. But it's of course a balance with the immediate humanitarian aid, but I also of course think that the long term, that's where also the biggest impact can and biggest changes last.
But I also want to add, just to a bit sum up from everything that you shared, that actually education is not just education. It's covering a lot of aspects within that, like resilience, peace, security, and as much as it's long term, we don't forget about that as well, because it's not covering only one aspect of a life, but it comes with so much behind that. And this is also probably for myself, like one of the arguments as well. And to continue, also just to say, with all of the challenges that we discussed, what gives you hope of global education to bring this future that we want to see, and that educations have this power on a global level? Like, what brings you this feeling of that everything going in the right direction?
Yeah, I think fighting spirit is a better word than hope in this current situation that we're in. But I would also say, as I represent the Labour's Youth League, where most of our members are between 16 and 18 years old, and I really see that fighting spirit in them. I see people engaging and learning about these topics, and talking to local politicians and trying to make this national policy. And I really do see that fighting spirit happening right now. And I think that is a reminder that what we're seeing now is really, really dramatic, and we cannot forget about it just because it's far away. I used the number 22 million that at risk of dying within 2030. That is more people than during First World War. The situation cannot be suppressed in the way. This should be on the front page of every newspaper every day. But still, we don't really talk about it that much. So I think we truly need that fighting spirit right now. And we need to organize that fight in a way that is more productive than what we have done before. And I think there are reform processes now that creates a momentum for that. We have the UN80 reform process, where they are looking at how we're going to rig the aid system on a global level. I think that is key, that Norway tries to show leadership in that process. because one country can't reverse the aid cuts that we have seen the last couple of years. But one country can take leadership and try to create a momentum so that we try to do it. And I think that is what we need to use that fighting spirit to do right now.
Are you going to talk to Jonas about this?
For sure, for sure. We try all the time.
I think I just want to add on to the fighting spirit. I agree. I think that's a good way to talk about it, and that's something that we see with our partners every day. In whether it's SINASU, the National Student Union in Zimbabwe, who are currently being persecuted and arrested by the police and denied bail, etc. It's a very complicated and difficult situation. We partner with a right to education campaign at SAIH University on the West Bank. We see that students are constantly fighting back to suppression and to governments or whoever who are limiting their right to education. So fighting spirit is definitely something that is clear.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of your experience that you shared, for your time, for our, I think, fruitful discussion. And we need just to move forward, keep doing what we're doing, and fight for this as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.